The history of the Feast of Corpus Christi begins with two girls aged 5 named Juliana and Agnes of Corniel, who were orphaned and taken in by Augustinian nuns at the Premonstratensian double monastery of Mount Corniel, near Liège. The Premonstratensians were known to have double monasteries, meaning half were men and half were women, one of the biggest being founded by Saint Robert of Arbrisel between Anjou and Brittany called Fontevraud, where the Count of Anjou and King of England, Henry II, was buried. The two girls just mentioned, Juliana and Agnes, were brought in as what are called nutriti, meaning they were, let's say, nutritioned in the convent, brought up from a very young age, partaking in the religious life there, receiving an education, and participating in monastic outreach like in the leper house that Mount Corniel had for lepers. After 8 years of this upbringing in the convent, Juliana chose to become a nun. After a time of education in a monastery or convent, an oblate, a child in the monastery, whether nutriti, orphans like Juliana and Agnes, or a child who had been given by his or her parents for whatever reason, maybe religious devotion, like thanking the patron saint of the monastery for a perceived favor, or maybe because the child just wasn't wanted, or maybe because they found some benefit for their family by putting the child there, that child would have the choice to leave the monastery or to become a monk or a nun, usually. While Juliana took on the religious life enthusiastically and became a nun, unfortunately her sister Agnes by this time is no longer mentioned in any historical record, and we can assume that means she died. The Diocese of Liège was a hot spot for Eucharistic adoration at the time, and the new nun Juliana eagerly took part. At age 16, she began to have visions during her time before the Blessed Sacrament. She told no one, besides Eve of Liège, an anchoress, which is basically a hermetical nun. This Eve is also the source for Juliana's life, being one of the first female vernacular French authors we know of, and Juliana would be one herself in time. In the vision, she told the anchoress Eve she saw a vision of the moon with a dark stripe across the center. The moon, she understood, was the church, and the dark stripe was the lack of a feast dedicated to the body and blood of Christ. By 1225, she became prioress of the convent of Mount Corniel, and that is when she spoke more about her vision. She told her confessor, John of Lausanne, who was a canon who had many contacts with big ecclesiastical figures like Pantaleon of Troyes, the Archdeacon of Liège, who would become Bishop of Verdun, Patriarch of Jerusalem, and then Pope in due time. There was also Bishop of Liège Robert of Tourette, Hugues of Saint-Cher, the prior provincial of the Dominicans, making him head of the Dominicans in France. None of these had any objections to the meaning of the visions or saw anything problematic in them. Keep in mind these are private revelations, which are never to be believed without any scrutiny, so they had to be analyzed for any heretical or potentially harmful aspects. But this vision, whether it did happen or not, was acceptable, and its consequences would be reasonable for the clergy. Around 1240, Juliana's life was disrupted significantly. The canonry and leper house came under a man named Roger, who took a severe disliking to Juliana, so he accused her of embezzlement of leper house funds and turned the people around the canonry and convent against her, so she had to flee. She was perhaps already disliked because of her strong reforming mind. Monastic houses in the Middle Ages had this pattern of strong creation, then fizzling devotion until some reformer abbot came and rejuvenated the monastic efforts, both spiritual and cultural, and even economical, and then it slowly fizzled out again until the next reformer came along, and so on. Each time there was some discontent with the reform since the monks or nuns had grown too comfortable and lax. This happened in the histories, for example, of Saint-Bertin and Fleury and Saint-Denis, where some monks would run off to England, or they'd make their own canonries or monasteries nearby. Some would eventually return, some wouldn't. So it's not surprising that some of Prioress Juliana's rigor would make her disliked. She received the help of her confessor, Canon John, canon of St. John's Basilica, at whose house she was able to stay, and she received Bishop Robert of Tourette's help, who ousted Roger and brought Juliana back. John and Juliana worked together to make an office for the feast, the Animarum Cibus. In 1246, the Bishop Robert instituted the feast, but he died later that year and never saw it through. With the permission of all of these, Bishop Robert of Liège instated the Feast of Corpus Christi, which bishops could do at the time. They were allowed to make certain days be feast days, certain days not. And we still have that today, actually. In the United States, for example, there are a lot more holy days of obligation in the archdiocese of Boston, Hartford, New York than basically anywhere else in the country. It was to be held on the Thursday after Trinity Sunday. In 1247, Bishop Robert of Liège died, and Roger came back to his former position over Mount Cornillon's double monastery and leper house, and Juliana was on the run again. She stayed at a few Cistercian nunneries before finding one where she could live in seclusion in the county of Namur. Before death, she had asked for her remains to go to Villers Abbey, where they were buried, but after a week her body was moved to the part of the cemetery reserved for saints. Her canonization would happen in 1869 by Pope Pius IX, despite the rapid growth of her cult in the 13th century. Hugues of Saint-Cher had some time after received an appointment as papal legate in Germany, Bohemia, Moravia, and Dacia, which is like Romania. And when he visited Liège in 1251, he saw the feast of Corpus Christi wasn't being observed, so he re-established it and did so in his entire jurisdiction as well. About a week later than in Liège, and he granted an indulgence for anyone who would go where the feast was celebrated and confess. This is only about 50 years after the Fourth Lateran Council, so the push for annual regular confession was a serious effort by the Church. On December 8, 1264, Pope Urban IV issued a bull, Transiturus de hoc mundo, proclaiming the feast of the body and blood of Christ. This was the first universal feast ordered by a pope, but it did not catch on right away. Transiturus de hoc mundo says that even though the sacrament is celebrated every day of the year, it is important to have a more solemn feast once a year, especially to confuse and refute the hostility of heretics. Also, it's because on Holy Thursday, the date of the Eucharist's institution, there's the washing of the feet, the confession of the faithful, and the Chrism Mass, so the celebration of the Holy Eucharist could easily be overshadowed and neglected, which was not proper for such an important thing. Pope Urban IV had his close theologian, none other than the great St. Thomas Aquinas, to compose an office for the feast. These were called Sapientia Edificavit and Sacerdos in Aeternum, the latter being the, quote, first theological statement on transubstantiation, which was believed since ancient times, but this is just a label put onto it. There are differences in these orders, and the one composed by Juliana and Canon John. Juliana's version had put words to new music, while Aquinas used already used music and changed the words for the office. The final polished version was sent to clergy around the area and to Eve, the anchoress to whom St. Juliana had confided long ago. The versions were developed further as they spread geographically through time. The song used on Maundy Thursday, Pange Lingua, was actually made for the Vespers of Corpus Christi and was written by Aquinas himself. The feast was slow to spread across Europe, but starting in 1265 it was to be celebrated universally, at least on paper. Aquinas' office was used outside of the Diocese of Liège, but in that diocese Animarum Cibus was used. At the time of the French Revolution, Liège began to use the office of Aquinas, but at St. Martin's Basilica, specifically, they maintained many parts of the original Animarum Cibus which were added to Aquinas' office. And over time, this feast would gain ground with processions and importance, recognition, and even indulgence, and it would become what we know today as the Feast of Corpus Christi. About 800 years later, we still celebrate it today.